Hi, I'm Mike from Craft Supplies USA, and today I'm going to show you how to turn a beautiful pepper mill. This mill I have here is our deluxe mechanism, and I've got a beautiful piece of tiger stripe maple. We'll be going over the form, getting the right shape and dimensions you want to have a nice beautiful looking pepper mill, as well as some of the tips and techniques as far as drilling and fitting the mill to the right length and body. There's a lot of steps involved when you're turning a pepper mill. I'll try and explain it as clearly as possible. There's going to be a lot of information in this video, and it's probably going to be pretty long, but there's going to be a lot of good takeaways and things you can learn as far as how to turn this, how to get the right proportions, shape, fitting, and how to have a beautiful pepper mill when you're done. So let's go over our blank selection, and then we can get into turning. So the piece of wood we're turning today is a piece of tiger stripe maple. There's a ton of curl in this piece. It's kind of hard to see in the rough sawn form, but we're going to be turning a 12-inch mill, so usually you want a blank 1 inch longer than your mill mechanism. I prefer about 2 inches extra, so I've gone with a 12-inch blank here, and it's 3x3. Having a little bit bigger body gives me more shape possibilities and form design you can do. So go 3x3x12, and you want to make sure that your piece is kiln dried as well. I don't want this to be warping or shifting after I turn it, because we have two pieces that are going to be fitting together. I want to make sure the piece is kiln dried or air dried at least, and preferably 6% moisture content. I've marked my centers on here already, so we can go ahead and put this between centers. Lock your tailstock down, go ahead and snug that up, and then we can set up our tool rest. The first steps in turning our pepper mill is making sure that we have the blank roughed out to round, and then we'll be turning 3 tenons. That way we can drill the body from each end, and then we can mount our headpiece. So here's the orientation of how the mill is going to look. So we're going to have a tenon on this end, right here in the middle, and then we'll have one on this end to hold the head for turning and shaping. So that's going to be our first set of procedures. When you're turning, obviously make sure you wear some eye protection, face shield, and then if you have a respirator or your dust collection going, go ahead and do that as well. So once I have my tool rest set up, make sure everything's locked down. Give that a quick spin, make sure you're not contacting your tool rest at all, and then we can go ahead and start roughing this out to round. We'll be using a spindle roughing gouge, and anytime I start the lathe, I always have the speed at 0, and then I slowly increase this to my desired turning speed just for safety. Right now for a 3x3x12, we're roughly at about 1200 RPM, and we can slowly start easing off the corners, and as we reduce the diameter and get it trued up, then we can bump up our lathe speed. I do want to note, usually when I'm roughing out a piece with corners on it, I usually wear a face shield just because a lot of times you get some big splintery pieces. You don't want to hit you in the face. One thing as well, as we're turning this down, it's going to start pushing the centers into the wood a little bit, so you might want to snug your tailstock up as you're turning. And just using that spindle roughing gouge, this is a really good tool for roughing material out because it's got a wide open flute. It removes a lot of material really quickly. Whenever I'm using the spindle roughing gouge, I like to keep my hand over the flute just to keep chips from flying up into my face and going down my shirt. Just make sure you keep your hands clear of the blank. And now we're working on this end. I'm going to rotate the tool over and cut towards the headstock. Obviously, anytime you start your turning project, make sure your tools are nice and sharp. Now that we have the corners mostly knocked out, I'm going to bump my speed up to about 1400 RPM. And we're getting some distance between our tool rest and the piece, so I'm going to bump this in just a little bit. Give that tool as much support as it can. You always want the cutting edge to be nice and supported, that way the tool isn't going to flex and chatter on you. You just check it, I can definitely feel some flats still on the piece. Okay, we're getting pretty close. We're almost to round here. There's a couple little flats in the middle and just a little bit on this end. All right, I'm going to stop the lathe and just take a look and see what kind of wood we're working with. So you can see there's a ton of curl in there. Obviously there's tear out, but you can see just a super dense curl we have in this piece. And once we get it finished and sanded and everything, this thing is going to be really pretty. So I'm going to snug up my tailstock. There was getting a little bit of chatter in there because it was getting loose. As you're turning this down, those centers kind of drive into the wood a little bit. So you always want to check your tailstock tightness and just make sure everything's still snug. And now that we're almost round, I'm going to bump the speed up about 1800 RPM. The faster you turn your spindles, the cleaner your cut is going to be. And we can also bump that tool rest in just a little bit. You can hear now that the chatter's gone now that we moved our tailstock and tightened it up a little bit. As well as the faster cutting speed puts less pressure onto the wood surface. Okay, we are just about round. There's just a couple flats right in the middle here. Okay, we're close enough to round. I'm going to stop the lathe and take a look. So you can see we reduced a ton of that tear out by bumping the speed up and doing a nice clean cut across the surface. Alright, so if I throw some alcohol on this piece, it's going to pop the grain and you guys can take a good look at, you know, the kind of material we're working with here. This is going to give us a really gorgeous mill by the time we're done. And on this piece, I already have my salt mill turned. I left this one natural to be the lighter color for salt. And on this piece, being the pepper one, I'm going to be throwing some chocolate dye on it to accentuate that figure and darken it up so I have a good visual separation between the pepper and the salt mill. Obviously, you could leave them both natural because the adjustment knobs are marked salt and pepper, but I think it'll be really cool to throw some dye on this piece as well. But really highly figured, just some beautiful material to work with. Obviously, anytime you're turning, the more pretty the piece of material you have, it's just more enjoyable, and it just ends with a better product as well. So now that we have this roughed out, let's go over our dimensions and we can get our head length and our body length marked out, and we can start cutting our tenons. So for this 10-inch mill, I've gone 7 3/16 on the body length. The reason it's 7 3/16 is I'm going to be drilling the mill mechanism in a little bit further than standard to account for the 7 3/16. Otherwise, it would be exactly 7 on the body and 3 on the head. So keep that in mind. So I'm going to be marking this. I'm going to go 7 1/4. And before we do our tenons, I just want to clean up the end here and make sure that surface is nice and true. That way it doesn't affect our overall length as well. All right, so I'm going to turn my lathe on. I'm going to use my skew to just square this up. It's pretty square. It's maybe a 64th out of square. I just want to true that up so my measurements are more accurate. So for the body, we will be incorporating the tenons into our overall length, so don't add a 1/4 inch on each end and then adding that up as your total length of 7 1/2, 7 5/8. So I'm going to be marking from my square end here to 7 1/4. And this is one of the things I've learned. This might be a little confusing if you've never turned one of these, but you can use a shorter mechanism and have a longer overall body depending on how deep you drill the recess for the mechanism. So if I want to have a 12-inch mill with a 10-inch mechanism, you're just going to have to drill that mechanism in further into the body to have an overall rod length of the 10 inches. So if you want to maximize the full 12-inch length, but you only have a 10-inch kit, just change your dimensions depending on how big your piece is, and then you can adjust that by drilling further or less depending on your blank. So we're 7 1/4, and that's going to be our cut for the body length right there. I'm just going to give those 2 lines there for my parting tool to cut into, and then I will be cutting from this end for the body length. I want the body at the base of the radius to be 3 inches, and then I want a 3/4 inch long tenon that will be going into the body to help register those parts. In the instructions, it says it calls for a 1/2 inch tenon. I like to just stretch that out a little bit if I have the material. That just gives you a little bit better fit and more durability in my opinion. So let's go ahead and mark these out. So I've got my tenon marks for my 7 1/4, 7 1/4. I've got my 3/4 long tenon, and then from the end of the tenon, I want the top of the mill blank to be 3 inches. So once I mark these out, I'll overlay the one I've already turned, and you can see how this is going to work out. Alright, so I'm going to take this apart so you guys can see exactly how this will lay out. So from my end of my blank, I've got 7 1/4. Then I have my 3/4 long tenon and a 3-inch long head. Obviously, when this is put together from this shoulder here to the top, it's 3 inches. And so that lays out nice and perfect. And I've got my 3/4 tenon. So when this thing's all put together, I've got the right length for my rod. So you want to be pretty close to your dimensions you need, but obviously if you screw up on your length and dimensions, you can adjust the fit by either cutting the rod or drilling the mechanism hole deeper into the blank. So now that we have everything laid out, let's go ahead and part this down so we can cut our tenons, and our tenon for the top of the head, and then we'll put our tenon on the end here as well. I also want to note for this, I want to keep these tenons as large as possible because we will be incorporating them into the shape. So it's not going to be ideal fit for the chuck size we're using, but I want to keep the tenon as large as possible. So I've got a nice square shoulder here. I think that tenon is just a little bit steep, so I'm going to just taper that off a touch. And then I like to chamfer my tenons just so they're not sharp. And then I'll get my narrow parting tool and cut a groove here. I'm cutting that groove so that way I have access room to cut my tenon on this end, and then I need to part this down as well. If you wanted to, you could incorporate, or you could cut off the tenons because we do have enough material. You could space it to where you could cut the tenons off. But I'm going to keep these tenons and incorporate those into that shape we have. So this is the mill head tenon. I'm just going to reduce some of the size on that as well. Get my spindle gouge in here and just pare this down. That'll give us enough clearance now to get our skew in there and cut our tenon. Get that shoulder cut nice and clean. I'm going to chamfer the tenon on that end just as well. The nice thing about the chamfer too is it helps prevent the fibers from crushing as easily. And now we'll move our tool rest over just a tad and we'll cut our tenon for the mill head. And then I'm also going to true up the end of the blank. And then give that a little chamfer. So hopefully the laying out of the measurements and the tenons is making sense to you so far. And just so we clarify, we've got the mill head, the mill body, we've got our tenons cut in, we've got our overall length at 7 1/4, then we have the mill head at 3 inches plus a 3/4 tenon, so 3 3/4 total overall length. The other thing too is right now, the reason we have 2 tenons is that way we can drill from halfway from each end of the blank, and that'll result in a more true drilled hole. A lot of times, especially on the longer mills, if you try to drill it all the way from one end, even with an extender, the bit kind of tends to wander. So I like drilling halfway from each end of the blank, and it has a lot straighter hole. So we'll go over the drilling steps here in just a minute. But what we can do now is I'm going to grab my pencil and just write top and bottom. Just so that way when I'm drilling I don't forget which end was the top or bottom, because I do want to keep that grain alignment as close as possible, even though we are going to have a 3/4 tenon, which will change the grain alignment a little bit. Just want to make sure I know exactly how this is oriented as a solid piece. Now we'll get our narrow parting tool and part this down. Once I get to about 3/4 of an inch diameter there, I'll get my narrow saw. I also release some tension on the tailstock. If you keep that really tight with the tailstock, it'll bind up on the saw blade, so I just loosen some of that tension. Okay. And now we're there. You can tell because the piece will flex and then bind on itself. So there's our mill body. We got it to the right length. We have our mill head. We have tenons so we can mount these pieces and turn them and drill them. And I'll set the head off to the side for just a moment. Chuck I'll be using is a VM 120 with the 2.5 inch dovetail jaws. When you seat that, give it a good flick. That way those two surfaces mount correctly. And I will be drilling this from the top first. So I'll be using my 1 1/16 bit to drill halfway from the top end first. Before I snug that down, I'm just going to turn this on at a low speed and see how true it is in the chuck. I can see it's out of round just a touch on the end here. Alright, so when you remount this on a tenon, where the tenon is oversized and we're punching into the corners on the chuck jaws instead of being a nice round circle like we usually try to shoot for, sometimes the pieces can be a little out of true. So if you do have a wobble to it, I like to bring the tool rest up really close to the piece, and then I watch the gap between the workpiece and the tool rest and find where it's not running true, and then you can just give it a good bump. And obviously we haven't tightened this down all the way, that way it can move a little bit in the chuck. So if it's not running true, just rotate that around, find your out of round spots, and you can just tap it and get that to run true. And once you've done that, you can go ahead and snug this down as well. So you can see we're maybe a 64th out of true, but we're removing so much material here, that doesn't matter. That is close enough for woodworking. So now I'm just going to double check, make sure everything's nice and snug. Before I get my Forstner bit out and drill this out, I'm just going to square this up and make sure I have a nice flat surface for that Forstner bit to register against. And because I'm about 6-7 inches out of the chuck, I don't want to put a lot of pressure into the workpiece, and my tenon isn't as secure as I'd like it to be. You want to be very light with your cuts. You can hear the chatter we're getting. That means just push a little bit lighter. Or that could mean your tool's dull. There's a bunch of reasons for chatter. Obviously we're extended out of the chuck a long ways, so that's going to be the biggest component. But then I'll get my skew and just give us a little center mark for that Forstner bit to help find the center. Now I can remove my tool rest, get that out of the way. And we'll take our revolving center out as well. Go ahead and mount your drill chuck or your keyless chuck. Make sure that seat's in there nice. I don't want this to come loose or start spinning on me as it's in the workpiece. Make sure that's nice and snug. Also make sure your set screws for your Forstner bit are nice and tight. You don't want to be drilling halfway in and then go to back it out and then the Forstner bit gets stuck in the piece. That's happened to me before and that was kind of a pain. So make sure everything's nice and secure, and we'll drop our drilling speed down. This is the 1 1/16 Forstner bit. Fortunately for this kit you only need 3 bits. You need a 1 5/8, a 1 1/16, and then a 9/32 for the top. So let's drop our lathe speed down to about 400 or 500 RPM. I also like to put a little bit of wax or some scratch free on the Forstner bit on the side to help reduce the friction. Anytime I'm drilling, I'm going to keep my tailstock loose and advance that bit, let it find the center mark. That way it's going to drill straight. Then I'll lock my tailstock down and then just snug up my quill a little bit to where I can still advance it, but it's taking the play out. Slowly advance that bit, let it find its center point. And then just slowly advance our bit through. Okay, I've noticed the chips have stopped ejecting on their own, so I'm going to back the bit out and clear those. I'm also going to throw on some more scratch free, and the bit's going to be nice and hot now, so be careful. The wax will just help keep the noise down, keep the bit a little bit cooler, and reduce the surface friction on the side of the Forstner bit. Every inch or so, make sure you back it out to clear those shavings, because all that debris in there just increases the friction, and sometimes those shavings get jammed up inside the drilled hole, and then it makes it a real bear to get your bit out. Now that we're getting in there a ways, I'm going to be running out of quill length, so I'm going to back it up a little bit and then just slide the entire tailstock assembly in. So that took a lot of pressure to back those shavings out. This stuff gets compacted inside the drill hole and also builds up that heat. So I'm going to throw a little more wax on. And remember, we're not trying to drill all the way through the blank. If we can get to about the halfway point or a little bit past, that's what we're looking for. Because when we drill from the other end, those two holes will meet up and it'll be a lot straighter than trying to drill this, 7 inches out, because this thing gets a lot of flex into it. I'm going to pull my quill back in and then slide the entire assembly forward. And then we can finish drilling. Right now we're about right here. Probably do one more pass. Just going to check my overall length, my pencil. So we're right about, yeah, maybe another quarter, half inch or so, and then we can flip this around. Once I'm done drilling my length, I'm just going to ream the bit out a little bit, just try and clear everything out of there and make sure everything's cut clean. Now we can take this out as well. So this is going to be the top of the mill body itself, so the orientation is like this now. I want to clean this surface up, sand it, throw some scratch free on there because we won't be able to cut this surface again. So now that this is exposed and we have our hole drilled, let's clean up this surface. We'll throw a little bit of a concave face to it so when these two parts meet up you don't have any gaps. So let's set up our tool rest. I'm going to bump my speed back up, about 15 to 1800 RPM, and I want to cut this nice and gently. We are unsupported and a ways away from the chuck body, so take your light cuts. If you do have a catcher, it might pull the piece out of the lathe, so just be careful. If you're worried about a catch and you don't want to start on the end, you don't have to, because we will be reducing the diameter of this quite a lot. You know, our final diameter is probably going to be somewhat close to that, so you can start chewing it up, you know, a quarter inch in from the edge to prevent a catch. Make sure you're on the bevel. Getting a little chatter. I'm just going to ease the wood off. Stop the lathe and take a look at the surface, see if we've cut it clean. Yep, so you can see the nice clean bevel ridden surface versus that last quarter inch is all tear out from the rough sawn. So that's nice and clean. Another thing you could do if you wanted, this might actually put more pressure onto the piece trying to pull it out of the chuck, but just a negative rake scraper, you can go in there and just gently glide that across the surface as well. So a couple different options for you. I'm also going to chamfer the inside of that drill hole. I just think it looks a little bit tidier. So I'm going to roll my flute over and just cut on the bottom wing. You don't have to. I just think it adds a nice professional touch to it. That way when your customer or whoever you give this to takes it apart to refill it, you can see those marks of craftsmanship throughout the piece, not just on the outside. Now that that's cut clean, we're going to sand it. I'm going to move my tool rest out of the way. Get my drill. Anytime I can use a power drill, I'm going to, because it's quicker. I'm going to start with 220 because we have a nice clean surface. Make sure that the drill isn't rotating the same direction as the lathe. Actually, forget to bump my speed down a little bit. Okay, surface is good with 220. The nice thing about using a drill is it prevents those radial scratches you get on using paper as well. And then I'm just going to make sure my chamfer's cut clean, see if I need to sand it. I think that looks pretty sharp. So we have a nice clean surface here. Obviously there's tear out around the outside rim, but like I said before, the diameter of this is going to be reduced into our nice clean cut surface. I'm going to bump the speed back up now, get some scratch free. I'm also going to go into the drilled hole slightly, just put some scratch free in there as well. If you want to, you can sand that just a touch. but that's all we need to do on this end. So this is the top of the mill body. Got a nice clean surface here because we won't be able to access that and cut it clean later. All right, let's flip this around. Now we can remount it and drill from the bottom. Just snug it up a little bit. One thing you can do too is while that's rotating nice and slow, bring up your center, and you can recenter off of that mark we had there from the revolving center previously. So that should be running nice and true now with the center. And now that that's squared up, then we can tighten our chuck down. Tighten up both those pinion gears. Make sure that the tension is even between the two of those. See, now our piece is running perfectly true. Now let's clean up this end as well. We squared it up with our skew, but I just want to try and cut that cleaner. That way we don't have any tear out we have to sand out later. We'll bump our speed back up to our turning speed, 15 to 1800 RPM. Make sure your flute is closed right here. Getting a little chatter off the tool, that's okay. Just make sure that surface is nice and flat for our Forstner bit to register against. And we should have a nice clean cut surface with no tear out. There is a little bit of bevel bounce we got there from pushing too hard. I just wanted to make sure I was putting pressure into the headstock as opposed to pushing the piece, trying to push the piece out of the chuck. So now that that end's cleaned up, I'm just going to make sure that the little taper we have there for the drill bit is nice and true. So we've got our 1 5/8" bit. We'll put this in the chuck. Make sure that your taper is seated nice and safe, and then we'll drop our speed back down. Forstner bits remove a lot of material, puts a lot of pressure on the wood, so you don't want to be drilling too fast, and it'll definitely generate a lot of smoke if you do. So tailstock is loose. I'll bring this up, make sure that the center point finds center. Once I'm running nice and square, lock it down and then snug up your quill just a little bit. Slowly feed that in. And because our mill body is 7 3/16, I'm going to go 3/16 longer than the 1/2 inch hole. And especially on a bit this size, you're removing a ton of material. So just do it nice and slow. Let the Forstner bit cut, and don't try and force it into the wood. If you drill slow, you're going to have a cleaner, more accurate hole as well, and it won't be a bunch of torn fibers. Okay, now that we've drilled that to our correct length, let's pull this out and we can finish drilling our 1 1/16 hole to meet up with the hole we previously drilled. Same thing just like the other bits. We'll bring that up to the center point, confined center. Once it's touched, go ahead and tighten everything up, and then slowly advance your smaller 1 1/16 bit all the way through. Once we meet up with the other hole, the tension advancing the bit will loosen and the sound will change as well. So pay attention. Once you get close to where you're going to meet up with that, you'll be able to feel a difference in the pressure it takes to advance the bit. Let's clear those shavings. Throw just a bit more wax on. This bit's definitely duller than the 1 5/8 bit. Carbide bits are obviously nice to have, but just make sure your Forstner bits are nice and sharp. I'm going to shorten up my quill a little bit. We're getting close to the end of travel. So we were running out of travel in our quill, so I went and backed it up. Okay, you hear the sound changing? Okay, we're through and we've met up now with the other drilled hole. So you can always tell the pressure on the tailstock when you're advancing it will all of a sudden loosen, but then you can hear it breaking through that where those two holes meet up. So the benefit to drilling from each end is you have a lot straighter hole, especially when you're doing like a 14 or an 18-inch mill. You're definitely going to have to drill from each end, but it just results in a more straight and more accurate hole. All right, now that we have our hole drilled, let's bring our tool rest back up. I'm going to concave the foot of this slightly, that way it sits nice and flat on the table. If you're getting a bunch of chatter, just take a smaller bite. I was probably taking too much material for the hold that we have. Okay, that's nice and clean. I do want to chamfer the inside of this hole because we will be registering on our revolving center a little bit later. So I'm just going to give myself a nice chamfer. Now we can power sand the base here. Drop your speed back down. And we'll be running the 220 grit. You can see that little tiny tool mark right there, but I'm not concerned about that because we will be turning that out as we reduce the foot diameter. I just want to make sure that inside 3/8 is nice and clean. Stop the lathe and take a look at the surface. So you can see that little tiny tool mark right there, but that's going to be turned out. The rest of the surface looks nice and sharp. We've got a nice concave base there, that way it'll sit flat on our table. And we can grab our scratch free and throw a little bit on. I'm also going to coat the inside of the drilled hole with scratch free as well. One thing you can do actually before I do that is if you have a bunch of tear out from your Forstner bit, we can cut that surface nice and clean. I'm just going to get my skew. Need to raise this up a tad. And I can go in there with the point and just cut that just a little bit cleaner. I'm also going to give that just a little more chamfer. And then if you want to, you can grab some paper and just hand sand right there on the edge. I think I might as well do that while we're here. Okay, that feels a lot smoother. Now we can throw some scratch free on the end of the blank and inside the drilled hole as well. You can see the scratch free really makes that grain pop, enhances that natural color. And this tiger maple is really dark for being an East maple. It has a lot of color, very similar color to a big leaf maple, but just a beautiful, rich color to it. So you can see the end of the surface here is nice and clean, as well as the drilled hole and the surface that we'll be mounting our grinder assembly to. So let's take this out of the chuck now. Oh, one other thing I forgot to mention is the benefit of putting some scratch free on here now is when we do help support this with our revolving center, it'll help prevent discoloration. Usually you can just wipe anything off if you get any on there later, but that'll help seal up those wood fibers and keep that from getting discolored later. It's time to mount the mill head into our chuck. Rotate that, make sure it's running true before you tighten it all the way down. Alright, now that our blank is mounted and running true, let's square up the end of our blank here. We're done with the spindle roughing gouge for a minute, so I'm just going to move this stuff out of the way and give myself some more clearance. And we can go ahead and square the end of the blank. We want to square this because we will be drilling the 9/32 hole for that rod to go through the head. We'll give ourselves a very small dimple. I'm going to be drilling with a brad point drill bit. I'm going to drop that speed back down. And because the bit length on this is going to be right about the max for this drill bit, I'm just going to drill it halfway, and then when we flip it around, we'll drill it from the other end as well. Same thing, anytime I drill on a lathe, I keep my tailstock loose, advance the bit until it finds its natural center point, and then snug the tailstock down and then advance the bit. I've found that tip to be handy doing pens, projects, pepper mills, anytime you're drilling on a lathe, do that and you'll have better results. Same thing just with the Forstner bits, make sure you clear the flutes out. I actually like to just dip the bit in the scratch free. That'll help keep it cooler, reduce friction. It usually helps the bit keep center when you're drilling over distance. And it just adds wax to the inside of that hole as well. It'll help prevent discoloration from the rod later. Just back and forth a little bit, try and clear out any of the shavings, and then drill as far as you can from this end, and then we'll drill the rest of the way from the top. Alright, so now that I have the end of the blank, or the mill head drilled, and we have our rough dimensions and everything, the next thing I want to do is fit our turn plate. You don't have to do this step, you can always just screw this to the end of the mill head tenon once you're done turning, but I like to have this recessed into the tenon itself. That way it helps center everything up when you go to put your screws in. So I'm going to adjust my tool rest. And I'll be using a skew to cut my recess. It's about 1/8 of an inch deep. You can go deeper or more shallow depending on whatever you want it to be like, but I want this to be basically flush with the end of the mill head tenon. It's a nice little added touch that helps you register the turn plate when you go to assemble the piece. And because we're cutting into end grain here, this little negative rake scraper or skew works really well. Just gonna hold that up there and kind of eyeball it. You can use calipers to get exact dimensions. Stop the lathe and do a test fit. So that is perfect. That's a press fit. That's about as good as it gets being my first try putting that in. So try and shoot for that if you can. And if you do get that and it is a press fit, just get the rod. You can pop it out. Okay, so now I just want to go a little bit deeper. If anything, I'd rather have the turn plate be recessed a touch rather than being proud of that tenon. So now if I bring that up, that's going to recess in there nice and good once I press that in, which I don't really want to press it in right now. But that'll help keep that piece nice and flush with the end of the tenon. It just adds a little bit of extra touch to it. So now that we have this here, I'm going to chamfer the inside of that drilled hole from my revolving center to give us some more support once we turn. And now we can start rough shaping the mill head and get our tenon size correctly. I'm actually going to switch to a shorter rest now for just a moment. It's always nice to have, varying lengths of tool rest. That way I can get the right clearance I need without having to have my tool rest crooked. But I can bring that up just nice and just lightly snug, not a lot of pressure there. Just something to help keep the end of that blank supported as we rough this out. So now we can start stepping this down. It was a peeling cut with a skew, but now I'm going to use my spindle gouge to give us a better, cleaner cut. And I'll get my calipers out. When I'm fitting my tenon, I don't want to get to my perfect size right now. I want it to be just a little bit oversized. That way we can use that to remount the mill body as we turn the mill body to shape. So I want it to be a nice snug fit, kind of a press fit when I put it on there. So don't go to a perfect size tenon. If you do that, it's going to be undersized and this is going to be really loose and sloppy as you're trying to rough shape the rest of this out. There's a couple workarounds. If you do screw up the tenon on this, you can always just finish turning the mill head and then get a scrap piece and turn a new tenon to turn the mill body with. But ideally, we're going to get our nice sized tenon here. Just eyeball that. Okay. The tenon diameter is going to be roughly there. I'm just going to set my calipers up there. I marked this for the inside of the drilled hole. So that's about 1/8 of an inch larger. The working fit that we want is going to be right about there, so that's just going to give me a visual reference as I turn this down. If it's getting a little chattery on the peel cut, get your tool rest more supported, or the tool more supported, bring that tool rest in. And the other thing too is this tenon, I want it to be nice and straight across. I don't want it to change diameter across the surface. I'll get in there with my spindle gouge to clean up the corner. Right now I want to get the perfect fit with my tenon. If you want to, you can always come in here with your spindle gouge. Cut this from the end. So I'm going just proud of my mark. It's nice and straight. I'm going to do just an 1/8 inch tenon for just a second so we can get a test fit. So we're pretty close. Maybe a 64th or a 32nd out. The reason I'm testing just the 1/8 inch end here is if I do undersize that, I still have, 5/8 of material I can still keep as a full size diameter tenon, and I don't have to worry about it. Whenever you're turning tenons for boxes or anything where you need the parts to fit nice and tight, always step your tenon first to make sure it fits before you turn the entire thing to that same size. Still just a bit proud there. As you're testing this, you can always just keep the revolving center out of the way. We shouldn't be generating too much pressure on the wood here without the center in place. Okay, and that is just about fitting in. Let's get our final fit. And the other thing to remember too is depending on your material, the fibers might compress once you press this on and then have a loose fit. But a piece like this, it won't compress too much, but there will be some compression. I'll show you. Okay, we're right about there. That's almost ready to press on. Let's go ahead and reduce the rest of the tenon. You can hear the chatter we're getting because that revolving center's not there now. That's all right. Again, we want to make sure that tenon is as straight as possible. I've left it just a little bit larger right here past our step. Okay. This is a little tedious, getting the tenon to fit nice and perfect, but I'd rather do that than have to come back and make a new tenon later with a waste block. So tenon looks nice and flat. If you need to, you can always get something that's flat like a ruler, straight edge. Just make sure your tenon's nice and straight. Okay, and that's slipping on there, and that's definitely a press fit. That's just a touch snug. I don't want it to be so tight that when I press this on, it splits the fibers of my mill body. But you can see there that burnish line right here, those wood fibers have compressed. It's also going to compress some of the wood fibers on the drilled hole as well. I'm just going to take a shaving off. And we should have the perfect fit. I'm also now going to clean up this face, and I'm going to concave it slightly. I want to concave that and concave this surface as well. That way when those parts meet up, they're registering on the largest diameter and you always have a perfect fit. between the mill head and mill body. You don't want any gaps or light between those two surfaces. But you can see we got a really clean cut off the spindle gouge. Now we can sand this surface. Just double check your mill body fit. That's going to be perfect. Once those fibers compress, we're going to have a really good working fit and hold for the mill body as well. Just going to sand the end of the blank here. We're not doing much sanding, so the speed's not too critical on this piece. Obviously turn it down slower than your working speed. And just clean up the ends there as well. I don't want to sand the tenon right now. We'll do that later once we go to get our final fit for assembly. However, I will throw scratch free on this face here. And I'll also put scratch free on this surface as well as where the turn plate's going to be mounted. Okay, surfaces look nice and clean. We have a really good working fit with our tenon. Once we're to this stage, we'll start rough shaping the mill head for our profile and getting our outside diameter for where we're going to meet up with the mill body nice and get it pretty close to shape. And then we can rough turn and get all this stuff turned away. So let's move our mill body out of the way for just a moment, and we can bring up our tailstock, mount that in the drilled hole for a little extra support as we're roughing and taking some heavy cuts on this side. And we can start turning the mill head. As we start to turn our mill head to shape, I want to match the outside dimensions that I have on this mill that I've already turned. That way we have a matching set. So I'm going to get my calipers and I'll set those to the smallest diameter of the mill head. I've got those ready. Now I can turn the lathe on at a nice slow speed. Just leave a little bit of a mark there with my calipers and then I'll pencil that in. Just a touch proud of where I want my final size to be. So that's going to be the diameter that I'm looking for on this smallest end of the mill head. So we can start rough profiling that and then removing a bunch of the bulk of the material on the mill head as well. So let's bump our lathe speed up. Again, we're supported by the tailstock now, which is good. Go to our spindle roughing gouge. Now I'll grab my narrow parting tool to neck this down and give us clearance, as well as a line to stop our shape at. I'm not going to make that tenon very small right now because I want to maintain the integrity of the piece and the support we have, so I've left that at probably 2 inches. I'm going to switch to my 1/2 inch spindle gouge and start profiling this out. I'm just going to chamfer the edge of that right there on the waist section. That way if I bump into it, I'm not going to get cut. Before I remove any more material, I want to mark the high point of my profile. So I'm just going to overlay that. That's going to be the center point of our shape, of that radius. That's going to be the high spot. So if I turn that on, I don't want to remove hardly any more material than just to get that spot true, and then we can start working our contour down on each side of that mark. It's always good to have the piece that you're matching close at hand so you can check your shape, check your dimensions, and just have something good to look at when you're trying to make the matching shape. A nice bevel riding cut, trying to get the curvature I'm looking for. I'm still just a little bit proud there in the center, not perfectly flat. I'm going to true up that surface so my bevel's not skating on me. Start working the contour. I'm not too focused on this shape right in here. I want to get the curvature right there, perfect. So right now I'm not focused so much on getting a perfect clean cut. I'm trying to get my contours right where I need them. Trying to get the curvature with the right shape. The radius is looking good. Just need to tuck in the bottom end here a little bit more. Okay, that's looking really good. Stop the lathe and take a look. Okay, that's looking really sharp. So obviously we have a ton of material here to remove still, but the curvature of the main body shape here is looking really sharp, and it's got nice clean cuts from bevel riding cuts. Obviously it's not perfectly smooth because I'm not trying to get a perfect even pass. I'm focused more on the shape right now. We can come back and clean this up just a little bit, but that looks pretty sharp. Let's go ahead and check our overall dimensions. I got my calipers set to the diameter of my turned mill head. You want to be careful when you're setting those. It's easy to mark up your piece because these points kind of dent the wood a little bit, so just be careful. I think we're just a little bit proud there in the center. Let's go ahead and take off a little more material. I want these to be as close to each other as possible. Those are very close. We probably have a 1/16 to go. think there's still going to be a touch more to take off. I think we're very, very close. Had a little bit of a high spot there. Just hit that with the spindle gouge. Very, very close. All right, let's keep reducing this and getting our shape the way we want it. Okay, so that's just about to slip over. Obviously when we sand, we'll be removing more material, so I don't want to go any smaller than that as well. And before we continue to reduce this diameter, now it's time to turn the mill body. So now that we have this rough profile and our diameter established here at the base of the mill head, we're going to stop with the mill head for a moment. And we can go ahead and put on our mill body and attach it to our tenon. Okay, now that we have our mill head roughed out and our base diameter to our final size, we can mount our mill body while we still have all the support in the top of the mill head. Let's mount this onto our tenon. If it's a little snug, I'm going to add just a little bit of scratch free onto the tenon to help keep that just a little bit slipperier. And then I lock the spindle as well so I can kind of twist it on as I go. Okay, we can snug that up. And then to help get that proper seating on the shoulder, you can advance your tailstock quill. And because we have that nice chamfer on the inside of the smaller drilled hole in there, it's going to register and seat nice against that revolving center. So I'll just give that a quick spin. Okay, that's running well. We've got a nice seat against the shoulder and the face of the mill head. And now that this is in there, we can go ahead and get our mill body to our right shape and dimensions. And so I've set my calipers to the outside diameter of the one I've already turned, and it's pretty close. We're almost about to slip over this surface here, so I'm not going to be removing a lot of material right here at the largest outside diameter. And so I want to go ahead and mark that before we start turning. And the apex of the shape on the mill body was right at 2 inches. So the largest diameter on the body right here was 2 inches from the end, and that's pretty close to what our calipers are already set at. So I'm just going to mark this here so I know this is my high point. And then that way the shape will flow downhill from the high point in the center. So we can get our spindle roughing gouge. Let's get everything set back up to turn. And one thing as well, before we start turning this, I want to set my diameter for the foot. Just going to grab my calipers. I put a rough mark on there. And we can go ahead and set our calipers now to match. That pencil mark I put on there was basically right where we need to be. So now we have our established dimension here that we need to turn to from our high point. So that gives you two good visual references. And then once we rough out a lot of the material here, we can set our calipers up for our neck diameter as well. So we'll turn our lathe speed back up, about 1800 RPM, and just start getting our flowing curve we want. I kind of like to work this in kind of two sections. I have my apex of the curve and the foot. I'll turn that and get that established, and then we'll go towards the neck, get that established, and then we'll get the very end here turned down as well and get that to the right diameter. I'm keeping an eye on my pencil mark. Looking for that smooth flowing curve from the apex to the foot. Okay, and I'm just proud of the pencil mark. So now I'll move my tool rest over and start trying to remove a lot of that bulk here in the center. And again, the reason we left that tenon a really tight fit is because we want to have a good working hold on the mill body. Occasionally just stop and check, make sure your curvature and your contours are looking good. I leave it pretty big throughout this section here and here, and then it has a pretty tight radius down to the neck. Just going to true up that surface there. Just keep an eye where you had your pencil mark. And right now I'm looking at the top of the blank on the horizon, watching the curve happen. I'm not too focused on what the tool is doing, I'm just watching how the cut is progressing. If you're not turning a set to match, it's a lot easier because then you're not focused on getting identical pieces. But when you're trying to match up shapes, it definitely makes it a little bit lengthier process. Okay, I'm going to mark the smallest diameter of the neck is right about here. We've got a 1/8 inch chamfer on the neck. So now I have some dimensions to work towards. And then once we get a lot closer to our final size that we can eyeball to on our turn piece, then we'll get our calipers out and get that exact diameter there. Here's a good catch for you. Come on, bevel, bevel. All right, let's stop the lathe and we'll get our calipers on the neck. So I'm going to get those just a little bit loose, that way I don't mar the piece. Getting my fit. So we still have 1/4 inch of material to remove on the neck. And what I'll do to do that is I'm going to get my narrow parting tool and actually cut that line in. And then give ourselves a dimension to work towards. And we can check that with our calipers as well. My calipers are a little bent, so they're not fitting in that groove perfectly well, but we're pretty close. So let's remove some more material, and then once we get very close to our final size, we'll grab the calipers again. I'm going to start cutting this chamfer down. I'm being very careful not to cut the surface there because we're pretty close to our final size. And the chamfer length on that is about 1/8 of an inch. Okay, I'm going to switch to my smaller spindle gouge to give myself a little more clearance. Bring my tool rest in just a little bit more, give myself more tool support. You can see the bevel tried to skate on me a little bit. Make sure that flute's completely closed. Let's double check our shape. It's looking pretty good. And now let's check our diameter here. So we're still definitely a little proud. I'm going to remove some more of this bulk here, and then we can get our perfect shape. Still some more room to go. I'm going to get my profile here on the back of the body a little more established. Just want to hold this up and check my curvature and make sure that's still looking correct. Those look pretty sharp. Those are close. Okay, if I just overlay those, I can see I've got a little bit of a high spot still here, and then we can work on flowing this curve to match this radius we have here, and then we'll get our final neck diameter. Alright, and now for the radius down here in the bottom, you can work that with your spindle gouge and come in from each side and then meet up in the middle. I'm just going to move my tool rest over a touch and then come in from this direction. I still think it's a little thick. Yep. But from now that we're super close to our final shape, I'm actually going to go to my scraper and just give myself that perfect flowing curve I want down in the bottom of the neck. This is also still just a little heavy. I'm going to turn this down a bit. Make sure the flute's closed. Still just a touch more. I'm actually going to go hit this on the grinder. I'll be right back. Alright, so I just hit this on the grinder. Alright, that's giving me a really good curve. Alright, just double check my calipers. Still just a touch proud. Just smoothing out the contour. If that radius is too tight, alright, if the curvature of your skew isn't tight enough to get in that radius, just get a regular round point or a French nose or a French curve scraper. And because this is a standard scraper, I'm going to go pretty light on the pressure. There we go, that cleaned that up really nice. One thing to note as well is when you're getting your neck diameter, keep in mind your drill bit size. We're probably 1.5 inches right here at the neck. But obviously when you start getting really narrow on a neck, just make sure you're not going to go through to that drilled hole as well. So that is almost going to slip over. We're right there. Just a couple more passes probably, and we'll be right where we need to be. Just checking the curve with my hand to see if there's any weird shapes or flat spots. You always want a continuous curve. That looks pretty good. Just double check these are still set. And we should be, yeah, those are slipping over. So by the time we sand, we'll be the exact size that we need to be. One other thing I'd like to do is I'm going to remove my tailstock for just a second and just match up the foot of this blank with the one I'm turning. And it looks like we need to remove just a tiny bit of material to make the foot of those match. That's a quick way because it's kind of tricky to get your calipers right where they need to be on a curved end piece like that. Just going to make sure the end diameter there is nice and perfect. And before we start sanding, just check your surface and see if there's any torn grain you want to cut clean, or if there's any weird flat spots or bumps. I think I'm going to hit this area with my skew and just lightly scrape it and just smooth out any imperfections before we sand. That way we can sand with 220 to start. Okay, but I think we're ready to sand, so I'm going to move my tool rest. I'm going to take my scraper, get some of these tools out of the way I don't need. We'll get our 220 on, and we'll also slow this down a ways. If you're getting some creaking, that's just the wood squeaking on the tenon. So just adjust your tension with your tailstock. And whenever you're power sanding, try and keep a constant movement. That way you're flowing with the workpiece and you're not staying in one place and creating divots or flat spots. Depending on your piece and the curvature right there, you might need to go to hand paper just to get in there and sand that curvature. Also, you can use the profile of your finger to help radius that. And then I'm also going to get that chamfer surface sanded. Try not to round over your chamfer too much, but I also don't want that to be a sharp edge there. I want it to look crisp enough to be neat, but not rounded over or sharp. We can jump up to our 320 now. Stop and inspect the surface, make sure you have no torn grain before you move on. Looks like I've got a little bit of a tear out right there. One thing I also like to do is just hit this with denatured alcohol to raise that grain. It will swell up the wood fibers a little bit and you'll be able to sand those down and make sure it stays nice and smooth. So that way down the road if somebody washes this, it's not going to be all rough and fuzzy. Yeah, and I can feel that's nice and rough again. So we'll let that dry for just a second and then we can sand that again with 320. But you can see the cool thing is you throw the alcohol in there and it makes that grain pop, gets you really excited about finishing the project. So You can friction dry it a little bit with your hand. Fortunately, alcohol dries really fast. So I'll start sanding down here while that's still drying. And then I'm also going to flip this in reverse and sand it against the way we've been sanding it. That just gives you a little bit smoother surface for your end product as well. It's feeling really good now. Looks like I need to spot sand this little line right here. If you're ever spot sanding, make sure to feather it in. Okay, that took care of that. So we've wet sanded, we've sanded up to our final grit. Let's get our Merlon. We're going to use some non-woven abrasive here, just to refine the surface even more. And then we'll hit it with some scratch free as well. Now that we're on to scratch free, let's bump our lathe speed back up. And you can see how it's just really making that grain pop. Get in onto that chamfer. That scratch free's got grit in it, so now we're trying to basically just refine the wood surface. And the more refined that surface gets, the more chatoyant the wood will be. If it's got figure, more natural chatoyancy to it. And then I'll get a clean rag and buff this off. All right, let's stop the lathe and take a look and see how the mill body looks. Okay, that looks spectacular. This piece has incredible curl through it, some really pretty color. I'm not sure how it's showing up on camera, but this looks really, really nice. And we also have it matching our current mill body shape. The curvature is basically right on, the dimensions are the same. So this will make a really pretty matching set. So now that our mill body's done, let's take it off. The next step for the mill body itself will be putting our dye on to differentiate the salt and pepper. But for now we can go ahead and put this aside, but you can just see how much figure that piece has. That's gorgeous. This is the kind of wood that gets you out to your shop and gets you to get going and turn it on a lathe again. Okay, now that we have our mill body complete, let's size our tenon for the mill body. We're going to want that to be a loose fit. We don't want that to be too tight, because obviously if it's tight, it's going to be hard to grind your pepper or salt, whatever you have in there. So we want that to just be kind of a slip fit, nothing that's going to add friction or pressure to it. So I'll get my 220, 240, and just lightly sand that tenon. It's not going to take much to get that to be the ideal fit. Let's go ahead and check it. So we're close. It's definitely a lot looser than it was. A few more seconds of paper and we'll be good. Okay, I'll get my 320. And then we'll hit that with scratch free. Okay, that's perfect. So now there's just a little bit of slop, but now it fits nice and free. So that way when everything's assembled, you don't have a bunch of friction or pressure on when you actually use the mill. Let's get our mill head neck down just a little bit more and establish the overall length that we need. Then we can power sand the majority of this, and then we'll part it off, flip it around, finish drilling out the hole for the mechanism rod to go through, and then turning our overall diameter for the adjustment cap. And you can bring up your revolving center, just give you a little extra support. Keep your turn mill nice and close at hand. That way you can match your contour. That tool is getting pretty dull. I'm gonna grab my other 3/8 spindle gouge, it's nice and sharp. Alright, so if I'm looking at my curvature, I need to start necking that down a little bit more right here. Just want to clean that up a little bit right here. And now I'm just going to use my skew to smooth out that radius and the profile and give us a really good surface to start sanding. I want to be careful not to reduce the outside diameter of that base there too much. But I'm just looking at the top edge here, watching my curves, making sure they flow. And we have our measurements already marked and everything's established. So now it's just trying to refine that without taking too much material away. There we go, I really like that curve now. Okay, now let's power sand the majority of this sphere here, and then we can part this off once we establish our overall length at the very end here, and we'll flip it over and then sand the rest of that. That was terrible. Let's drop our speed down. Let's get our 220 back on here. I think that's just a little slow. And as we're sanding, if you guys want to drop a comment down in the section below, where are you guys from and what is your favorite wood to turn? It's always good hearing from you guys. I really like turning myrtle myself. This figured maple though is pretty hard to beat. I'm gonna be really excited to see this thing done. I think once we get the die on there, this thing's just gonna pop. It'll be a really nice matching set. Okay, so we've sanded to 320. I don't know why I said 200, but I've never had a 200 grit paper. So we've sanded to 320. Let's hit that with some alcohol. Raise the grain, hit it with 320 again. Especially this part where you're gonna be using this to activate the mill. You want this to be super smooth. You see how it just wicks into the end grain right there. Friction dry that. And then make sure to feather and blend that. Okay, that's really smooth now. Okay, feels great. Let's get our Merle on, same thing. Because we're not power sanding, I'm just gonna bump that up a little bit. Try and burnish that surface as well. And then we'll hit it with some scratch free while we're here. But that feels really smooth. Great feel in the hand. And let's see how it looks. Okay, good. There's no torn grain, no tool marks, no sanding scratches. Looks really good and it feels really smooth as well. So before we move on, we need to be 3 inches from the shoulder here to where the adjustment knob is going to sit. So if I set that at 3 inches, we're basically just past that tear out section right there. And we can shorten this a little bit after we part it off. So if anything, leave it just a 1/16 or an 1/8 inch long, and then we can always part that down later. I'm gonna try and get my tool rest up in there as far as I can. Obviously I want to be careful not to hit the finished surface with the tool rest. So what we had was 3 inches, was basically there where the tear out ended. We can go ahead and part that down, and then we'll use our handsaw to cut that off. Just going to loosen the tailstock up a little bit, and then that cuts off clean. The reason I saw that off instead of parting it all the way down and then breaking it off is I don't want to have any tear out because we're pretty close to our final length that we need. So we can take our 120 chuck out of the lathe and put on a VM100 with some extended pin jaws that we can use to hold our mill head. Give that a little flick. And now we can mount this in our chuck, and I don't want to over grip this. Just snug, because I don't want to leave a bunch of dents in the work surface. If you wanted to not use a chuck jaw and worry about those grip marks, you could always get a scrap lock and then turn a hole for it, and then just do a press fit, like we did kind of with the mill body. Get a piece of scrap wood, turn a hole for it, and do a press fit. So that's running nice and true. I'm going to square up the end of the blank. That way we can drill the hole all the way through the center. And I'll bump my speed back up. And right now I don't have a super hard grip on this tenon, so I want to be nice and gentle with the tool. Just a touch high for this tool. Nice and gentle. And I especially don't want to push too hard on this to where it comes out of the chuck and then puts a big old dent in the side of the mill head. Then you're starting over, you have to remount it and turn all that stuff away. So nice and gentle. Create a little dimple for that brad point. And now we can put our drill chuck back on. If you're watching this video, this is one of those projects where there's a ton of things and steps and procedures you have to do to get the project completed. It's definitely more complicated in ways than a bowl because there's so many processes and orders that you have to follow to make it work right. But hopefully you guys can follow along while you're, watch this while you're in the shop and then make sure everything's still tracking with you. So tailstock loose, let that bit find its center point and then lock it down. And then we'll just slowly advance this bit through. Okay, we've drilled through and met up with the other hole. So we've got a nice clean hole on this end. Now let's finish getting our final shape and profile here on the end to meet up with the end cap. So right now, ideally, we'll have the end of the piece of wood be the exact same diameter as the adjustment knob. So we'll want to maintain the curve that we have here and then get a nice smooth transition and a little profile shape right there to match up, and that'll tie in nicely and then end up looking like this. Let's get our drill bit out of the lathe, and we will be using our revolving center here in just a moment. So let's put that back in and center that up. Right now with the tailstock, very, very gentle pressure, just enough to help support the end of the blank. But it's really, really easy to over crank this and then split the end of your mill head. So be very careful. Just finger pressure and then lock it down. That's all you need. 3/8 spindle gouge is a great tool to make this curve. We want this radius to flow nicely into that concave radius. We have a nice, gentle, smooth flowing curve across the mill head. Swing that handle, make the curve. If your spindle gouge bevel length is too long, you're probably not going to be able to make that radius. So do what I've done and just grind the heel off, give yourself a double bevel. That way it'll help you be able to make that curvature there. Okay, we're really close. I'm going to turn that down just a couple more cuts and then we'll check it. Obviously you could get your calipers out. I think we're right about there, maybe just a hair more. I think we're pretty close. Okay, we're about a 32nd, 16th over. And the other thing too is I do want to chamfer the end of that cap. So while the tailstock is out of the way for a moment, I'm going to clean that up as well. Right now we're pretty much finished, so I want to make sure that my flute is completely closed, because if I start this cut and I'm not on that bevel with the closed, that thing is going to skate all the way up the face of this about to the midpoint, and you're going to have a bad day. So make sure your flute's definitely closed over. And then we can clean that face up. We'll see if we can do this without the tailstock in place. All right, let's stop and check. Okay, still just a tiny bit proud. I want that to be nice and even with the end of the piece. And I do need to account for sanding, so I do want to be slightly proud right now, which looks like we're maybe a 64th larger in diameter. And that's going to be perfect. Now we can sand that down and be right on our fit. The other thing too is I'm going to chamfer the inside of that hole slightly with my skew. Or my spindle gouge depending on my angle. So I'll move this out of the way. Move some of my tools I don't need anymore out of the way. And then we'll power sand this. This surface, all was bevel ridden. I think it's clean enough to start with 320. And that way it'll save me time from having to blend back and forth between the two grits as well. So if the disc holder doesn't allow you to get in there based on the size that you're using, go ahead and go back to your sandpaper, the sheet abrasive, or your Merlon. Use your finger to get in there and get that perfect radius that you need. And before we get too far with the sanding process, I just want to double check our overall length. Yep, and we are a 1/16 shorter than 3 inches, which will be just fine because that mill mechanism has plenty of play in it. So that's going to be perfect. We're spot on with that. That's what we're looking for. Ideally, anything more than a 1/16, you might have to adjust the rod length or adjust the length of this and turn that down just a hair. Just working those sanding lines laterally here. So one thing I don't like about sheet abrasive versus power sanding is you do get radial scratches. More so with sheet abrasive. I'm also going to hit this with the denatured alcohol. I want to make sure that the mill head is as polished and as smooth as possible, because if it's rough, you're really going to notice that when you're using it. Alright, just sand those down by hand. Now we can grab our Merlon. Alright, so get your Merlon, just go over that surface one more time. Get this as smooth as possible. If you wanted to sand to 600, 800, and then go to Merlon, you're definitely welcome to do that as well. And now we can hit it with some scratch free. Let's bump that speed back up. Make sure to hit the end of the cap here, or the mill head. And then I'm going to roll this over. Get some scratch free into that drilled hole. If your tailstock's in the way, obviously slide it back. As always, anytime you can remove the revolving center, the better, because numerous turners have hit that with their elbow and put a nice little divot in there. It's kind of like the turner's scar. Everyone's got one a little bit. If you have hit your revolving center with your elbow, go ahead and leave a comment below. Let's hear about it. Give it a thumbs up. Okay, so the surface looks really clean. No tear out, no sanding marks. We've got our overall length exactly right, just below that 3-inch mark we needed. Our tenon's good. This is drilled out nice and good for the rod. Let's go ahead and take this out of the lathe and see how it looks. It's a beautiful piece of maple, tons of chatoyancy. This thing's gonna have tons of character once we put the dye on. And if you don't want to do dye, just leave it natural. It's a beautiful piece as it is. So there's our mill. We line up the grain a little bit. That is a really gorgeous mill. So now that everything's turned, we've got our shape, matches up with our salt mill. Take a look at those. That's a gorgeous matching set. Now we're ready to throw on some dye. That way we can differentiate between the salt and the pepper. So I'm going to set this aside and we'll prep for our dye. Alright, so let's get our dye ready. I've got some paper towel. You're definitely going to want to use some rubber gloves. And the dye I want to use today is going to be the chocolate. It's a nice rich brown color, especially once we cut it back just a little bit. It's just going to amplify the natural figure in the piece and the color. and give us a really good contrast between the salt and the pepper mills. One thing about this dye is it stains everything, so try and keep it off your lathe, keep it off your clothes, and most importantly, don't spill it on the floor because it will stain concrete as well. First thing I want to do when I'm dyeing this piece is we'll dye the faces, the tenon, all the pieces we can access once the mill's together, and then we'll put it on the lathe together and do all the exterior dyeing. So I'll set the head down for just a second and saturate my cloth. So I've got my dye, or my rag, saturated with dye, and we're just going to dye the tenon and all the faces on the inside of the piece. And because the dye is alcohol based, it will saturate and pull through even though we have scratch free on the surface. Depending on whatever wax you use, you may or may not have an issue, but with the scratch free it isn't an issue at all. So the end grain is definitely going to soak up more dye, so make sure you saturate and coat that very well. And then I'll just set that off to the side for a second. And then grab a clean rag. And take off any excess dye on the ends there. So that piece is done. Let's do the top of the cap here because we will have our revolving center in here. We're not going to be able to get the dye in there, so just make sure you do that off the lathe. Also, I've rolled up the rag to get inside the drilled hole. Just make sure you coat that really well as well. So we'll set that off to the side for a second. Now we can do this face, and I'm going to do inside the drilled hole a fair ways, just because I don't want to see as much of that contrasting material on the inside when someone goes to fill it up. And then we can flip this over and do the bottom as well, and then we'll wipe it off. The nice thing about this dye as well is it does have some shellac in there, so it helps set the dye. And we'll get our clean section rag. Kind of work that in, buff that, trying to even it out. Okay. Now that we have those inside surfaces coated, let's put that together and then we can mount that on our chuck inside the drilled hole. Just going to expand that open for just a second while I bring my tailstock up. And then just snug is all we need, just enough to be able to drive the piece and rotate it as we're putting dye on and then buffing the dye. And then my tailstock pressure also is really, really light. If you get too crazy, obviously you can split that in there, so be very, very careful. But I'm going to turn the lathe on nice and slow. We're maybe 200 RPM. I'm going to open up this rag and just get a little bit bigger piece, but I'm going to lay this out on the shavings so it can dry out. Get a little bigger section of rag, and then we'll saturate this so we can start coating the exterior. I want to try and avoid putting dye directly onto the piece because a lot of times it oversaturates certain areas and darkens them unevenly. So make sure you do it on the rag and then try and blend those areas back and forth. Because this piece is figured, we're working with end grain and side grain depending on the curl. And then the mill head in particular, because it's tapered, it's all end grain, so it will be a little bit darker. But we want to try and make it as even and consistent of color as we can. And then I'm going to put on a few coats of dye, make sure this thing's fully saturated. Now I'm going to put the cap back on this. I think we're done with the dye for a moment. Just lay your rag out, make sure you hang it over your trash can, let it fully air dry before you throw it away. That way it just doesn't combust on you. And then we can bump our lathe speed up to about 500-600 RPM. And we'll try and burnish the surface now. Try and buff that in a little bit because there is the shellac in the dye. It basically is a friction polish with dye in it. So you want to try and cure that friction polish. Make sure to hit the ends there because a lot of times you have dye go over and then you have dark lines. So make sure you hit the end. Flip that over, get a clean section of rag. Now let's stop the lathe and inspect the surface. So you can see how that chocolate brown really made that wood look very rich and it accentuated the grain. Now we can cut back through it a little bit and expose some more of the natural wood color to it. And then those dark end grain lines in the figure are still going to remain really, really dark. So when we cut through it a little bit, we'll have a lot more contrast to the piece and it'll make that figure show even more. So we can grab our Merlon pad that we used earlier and just start cutting through that. And you can see it's already getting lighter down here and we're taking off dye. Sometimes the Merlon will clog up a little bit because of the shellac. So just flip to a new section. And you want to remove that dye in a nice even manner. So I can see it's pretty dark still here. This is nice and blended even. This is nice and even. Still pretty dark right here in the low spot. So now you can really see the difference between the end grain and side grain. All the end grain fibers are running this direction. So those are the dark areas because that dye has penetrated deeper into those fibers. Make sure to get the little chamfer here. And then I'm going to blend the nose of the mill head. It's just a little too dark. So you can see we're definitely taking dye and the shellac out. Let's get to a new clean section of cloth. Now we can stop the lathe and take a look. So now you can see we have a lot more contrast between the figure and it really pops. And if I hold that, let me grab a rag. If I compare that now to the salt, we have a really good visual contrast when these are on your table, and that dark chocolate just makes that maple look so rich and beautiful. So really happy with those. Now that we have our dye completed, we can go ahead and throw our final finish on, and then we can put this mill together, and then we'll be done with the project. All right, so this is the tried and true varnish oil. This is my favorite version of the tried and true finishes. Seems to be just a little bit more durable than the other two for this kind of project. And I'll get a tiny section of rag. And the good thing about this finish is it doesn't have really an odor to it. It's all food safe, natural stuff. And a little goes a really long way. I'm not even actually going to use the jar. I'm just going to use what was on the lid. And that's still going to be tons of finish. So I'll start buffing that in, and that's just going to make that color even, pop even more. Really enhances natural wood color. And after you get a few coats on there, it's just a beautiful finish. And the nice thing is too, is the more you buff it into the workpiece, the better it looks. But for this, basically what we'll be doing is one coat right now. We'll do a nice kind of heavy coat, so to speak. We'll let it sit for 60 minutes. And then we'll come back and buff off any excess finish that's just kind of sitting on the surface. And then we'll let this sit overnight. Then tomorrow we'll come back in. On this piece, we'll get the Merlon and just kind of burnish and buff the surface a little bit. Then we can throw one more coat on. And after 2 coats, you can be done. Or if you want, you can put another 3rd coat on in the same manner. but you can see how it just really makes that maple pop. It's a really complimentary finish. You could also use water locks if you wanted. Spray lacquers are nice too. But I really like this tried and true stuff. Just checking the mill body to make sure we have the entire thing coated. Make sure you get the base here on the foot, because that's usually a surface you wash off a little bit every now and again after if it gets food on it or anything, so make sure that's nice and sealed. Also, the cool thing with putting dye on it is the shellac in the dye on all the surfaces on the inside that we put on there. It'll seal those up and help prevent any damage down the road as well. And because this is figured and we do have end grain, some areas might take more finish than other areas, so just double check your surface and make sure everything still looks nice and wet. Like the end grain here on the mill head is definitely soaking it up really well. Okay. There's our first coat of finish. We'll put the lid back on and set this aside. We'll come back in an hour and buff off any excess finish, and then we'll let this cure overnight. 24 hours usually is ideal. And then we can put another coat on in the morning. So we'll see you guys in a minute. All right, so we put our initial coat of the tried and true finish on. We wiped it on nice and heavy. Now we've let it sit for about an hour. So now let's turn the lathe on. And then we'll just buff off any excess finish. And then we can let this sit overnight. With this finish in particular, because we already have the shellac base from the dye, I'm only going to do 2 coats on this. So tomorrow will be our next coat, and then once that one is fully cured for 24 hours, I'm going to throw a nice little top coat of wax on there to help maintain the finish and help protect it a little more, and then we can put this thing together. Okay, now that we've buffed that, make sure your rags that have any finish on them are laid out to dry. And now we have a nice, even, consistent tone and finish to the wood. So let's let this cure overnight, and then we'll come back and put one more coat on. All right, so we let this set up for 24 hours. It's got a really good finish and tone to the wood. Really enhances the grain and the dye we put on. And I'll put on one more coat just for durability's sake. And a little added protection. If you want to wear gloves, you can. But this stuff's food safe, so I'm not worried about skin contact. Just going to rub in a nice even coat. Make sure to hit the bottom of the mill. This finish goes a really long way. I find putting it in one of our little finish bottles a really good way to store it as well as use it. Just a little squeeze bottle is a lot handier than this larger tin. So I usually try to keep a bunch of those utility bottles in my tool cabinet that I can fill up. Okay. Just buff that in, make sure you've coated everything with a good solid even coat. And then we'll let this set up for another 24 hours. And then we can take this off the lathe, put our mill together, and then if you want to throw on a top coat of wax, you can definitely do so. Again, store your rags nice and safe. Make sure they dry out before you throw them away. Reduce that fire risk. And we'll see you guys back tomorrow. All right, so we've let our finish cure, our second coat. We've let it cure for another 24 hours. So now basically our finish is done, but I want to put on just a protective top coat wax that I can reapply as I use the mill over time. I'll be using the goat wax. This is a food safe blend, beeswax, some mineral oil, and a nice citrus scent to it. So I'm going to make sure that my tailstock is still nice and secure, and then I'll slowly turn on the lathe as well. If you want to use something a little more durable than this, you could go with a carnauba wax. It's going to be a harder wax, but you'll have to use a buffing wheel type of system to get that on there. And that will have a little bit higher gloss as well because it's such a hard wax. But this is nice because every time I sell a salad bowl or a set of pepper mills, I always give them a can of wax they can reapply to keep that finish looking in pristine shape. One thing to mention is this wax can be buffed on by hand off the lathe, but I'm going to use the lathe and a little bit of friction to just try and heat up the wax and melt that into the surface, and then just buff it in evenly. The wax is nice because it helps waterproof the wood fibers. It has the nice citrus scent to it, and then just gives the wood and the finish and everything just a little more added protection for durability's sake. You can see it's buffing up the finish of the surface there. It's getting a little glossier. The other nice thing too is this wax has a really good soft tactile feel to it, so it leaves the wood with a really good finish. Feels really good in the hand as well. Now that I've got a good coat of wax on there, I'm just going to get a clean section of rag and then just buff off any excess wax or any streaks or marks we have on the surface. All right. Let's go ahead and take this off the lathe now. And because we have that loose working fit now on the mill head, make sure you hold on to that as you're taking this off. You don't want to drop it and put a big old dent in the side of your mill at this stage. But there's our mill. This thing's finished and ready to assemble. I think that color looks really pretty, especially when you set that up next to the natural one that will fill with salt down the road. I think it's a pretty good looking set right there. So let's clean our lathe off. We'll get our mill mechanism components, get this thing assembled, and then this thing will be done. Before we assemble, let's go over all the components. Let's go over their terminology. That way when you're putting these in, you know exactly how they go into the mill and in the correct assembly. We have the mill shaft, the male grinder, the female grinder, the turn plate, the adjustment knob, the spring bar, our 4 screws, and our retainer bar. Before we do our final assembly, let's put all the components into the mill and make sure that our shaft protrudes the right amount of length for the adjustment to work. And then if we have to do any extra turning and shortening some of the components or adjusting the rod fit, we can do that. But let's do a test fit first. First thing we want to do is we'll get the mill shaft and the mill grinder. Make sure that the square is facing down. We'll drop that right onto the rod. Get the female grinder with the text facing down. Drop that over top of the male grinder. Then we can get our spring. Make sure that the large opening of the spring is facing up. And then we'll get our spring bar with the tabs facing down, and we'll drop that over. That spring bar will interface with the larger opening of the spring, and then we'll align the tabs that are cut out into the female mechanism with the spring bar, because as that's in the mill, that's going to drop down over the female grinder. So I'm going to compress those components, and we'll press those into the mill body. Just make sure everything's aligned and pressed in all the way. That way your length is accurate. And then we can grab our mill head and drop that over the top. We're looking for 1/4 inch to 3/8 of the threaded section exposed. That way you have a full length or a full range of motion for adjustment in your peppercorns. In the salt, it's not as critical because the salt's usually ground a lot finer. But for our peppercorns, we want to make sure we do have a range of adjustment. So as long as you have 1/4 inch to 3/8 of thread exposed, you're good to go. If it's shorter than that, you can get a longer rod and cut it down to make sure you have the right length, or you can re-chuck the mill head and then just shorten up that end there a little bit if you need to. So now that we know those all fit, we can go ahead and screw everything in place, and then we'll be done. I'll leave all the components assembled onto the mill shaft, and then we can go ahead and get this prepped for the screws. Now that we've done a rough assembly and we know that the mill and the mill length and the rod and everything all fits together and goes together well, we can pre-drill the holes for the spring bar and the retainer bar. You don't want to just drive those screws straight into the wood because you risk splitting some of the wood. So I've got a drill with a 1/64 bit I'll pre-drill the holes for the turn plate and the spring bar and retainer bar. The screws are about a 1/2 inch long, so make sure you drill at least 3/8 to a 1/2 inch deep. So we have our holes pre-drilled. That's ready for final assembly. And now we can drill out the holes for the turn plate. Alright, so let's put in our turn plate. This will be a nice little press fit because we got a really good fit when we turn the recess. So make sure that's pressed in. If you need to, flip it over and then just push down on it. Get that fully seated. So that's nice and flush with the end of the mill. Now we can pre-drill that. Now we can go ahead and put the screws into the turn plate. Just going to set those in. Make sure those screws are nice and snug. But now the turn plate is assembled, and I think it looks really sharp having that recessed into the mill head itself instead of having, that little plate protruding from the end there. Now we can assemble the screws for the retainer bar. So what I'll do now is I'll install the mill head. We'll drop our assembled rod components. Drop that through the turn plate. Line up your female grinder with the tabs on the spring bar. Make sure everything's in alignment. I'll compress the spring and we can install the adjustment knob, and that'll keep all those components in place until we get the retainer bar in. So make sure that your female mechanism lines up with the tabs on the spring bar. And now we can add, I'm going to make sure that the text is all facing the same direction. So the retainer bar and the female grinder text is all, nice in alignment. Just a nice little added touch there. I'll drop my screws in. Now that our mills are complete, it's time to fill these up with some salt and pepper, and I'll show you how to do the coarseness adjustment and how to get a different grind depending on what you like. So first thing we need to do is take off the adjustment knob on both of the mills. Set those aside, and then we can fill these up with whatever peppercorn blend you want to use and whatever salt you want to use. This is just a peppercorn medley, it has a bunch of different peppercorns in it. It's got some good flavor. And then you don't want to fill those all the way up because you need to have room for the tenon on the mill head. So just make sure you have about an inch or so below the top of the mill body. On my salt, this is just a pink Himalayan salt. Go ahead and fill that up. Then we can put our mill heads back on. So I'll screw those on until they're just snug, and then I'll do a test fit on the grind and see if it's as fine as I'd like. And if it's too coarse or too fine, you can adjust it just by tightening this knob so it pulls that male mechanism up into the female mechanism, and then it changes the grind. So to make it a little finer, tighten that knob down, and then you'll get a lot finer grind. Especially with salt, that's kind of what you're looking for, is a really fine grind. You don't want chunky salt. And then for your pepper, usually you leave that a little bit coarser. That for me is just a little bit too coarse unless you're trying to do like a rub for some steaks. And you can always tighten that up and then get definitely a finer grind for your salads or whatever things you're going to put this on. So that's how you adjust your mill. But now those are full, ready to use on our table. Now that our mills are done, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments section below. I always look forward to hearing from you guys. In the meantime, subscribe to our channel for more wood turning videos and give this video a thumbs up.